Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to CSIS. We're really delighted today to have, and I'm going to try this in the Norwegian pronunciation, Eirik Wærness.
Very good.
All right. Right. Anybody out there that's Polish, my name is really Szymanski, but I gave up about 40 years ago trying to say it that way. Eirik is the chief economist at Statoil. You all know that. Great, tremendous broad experience in government, academia, and the private sector. He's been doing petroleum economics for a long time, macroeconomics when he was on the executive board of the Central Bank of Norway, has done tax analysis, corporate strategy. He's responsible for strategic direction for the downstream businesses at Statoil. Lots of economic and strategic thinking has gone into Eirik's career. The outlook, the energy perspectives for 2017 that was just published recently by Statoil is a really, really interesting document. This is the 7th year that Statoil has done their energy perspectives, and it's set up on a scenarios basis. Eirik will describe the 3 scenarios and some of the thinking behind those, but what I found in my career as a financial analyst and then in running EIA was that point forecasts, which everybody wants, are almost inevitably wrong. So then that gives forecasting a bad name, and now you can be tracked through, Google for all of the bad forecasts that you made years ago. So does that mean that forecasting is not useful? And the answer is no, it's still a very, very useful thing, particularly if you can look at a likely case and then cases around the likely case and look at the differences between the two. And it's the differences between the cases that you develop that give you insight into what's going on and where the opportunities and challenges lie in that business. And that's why it's important to think about these scenarios as not which one is going to be right, but how do they interact, and what are the differences between those scenarios, and what can you learn from that? And Eirik is going to explain all of that to us right now. So Eirik, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's good to be back at the CSIS. As Adam said, it's the 7th year we do this. For the first time, we expand the time horizon to 2050, and that means we've had 2040 before. Doing it 10 more years is that we have 10 more years of not knowing anything about what's going on. So the outcome space becomes even wider. The uncertainty for where the world is in terms of energy, global energy markets by 2050 is huge. And explaining how things we do today potentially might affect that development is also very difficult. So what we do with the Energy Perspectives report is that we summarize research that we've done internally. It's a global outlook. It's global in its also in its coverage of energy. So it's not only oil and gas, even though we are mainly an oil and gas company, rapidly becoming an energy company. It's a piece of analytical work. It's independent. The CEO and the chairman of the board of directors in Statoil did not approve a word in this report until it was printed, and since then I think they've approved of it. But it's not Statoil's strategy, to be clear on that one. We have a strategy. Our corporate executive committee has sharpened the strategy, including sharpened our climate ambitions, but that's a strategy that is supposed to be robust, hopefully be robust against very different outcomes. And some of those outcomes might be the scenarios that we describe in this report. So that's what it is and what it isn't. looking to 2050, what we have done is we've developed 3 different scenarios. We have the same names in the scenarios as we had last year, but the contents of the scenarios naturally change a bit, both in terms of when we take the time horizon 10 years longer, when we look at a new set of updated historical data, which brings us 1 year further forward, and also when we look at what's going on in terms of technology changes and policy changes that might then reinforce the developments in some of these scenarios. So they're not the same scenarios as they were last year. They're really different, and none of them are business as usual, meaning that there are significant changes in technology, markets, and policy to different extent in the scenarios, but compared to what we see today. The renewal scenario, which is a tremendous challenge, is a scenario that we should all wish for. But wishing for something for Christmas doesn't mean you always get what you want. So we have to keep our analytical eyes open. We have to be honest about a situation where the world might develop in different directions. But the renewal scenario, the light blue one, is a scenario where we deliver on reducing CO2 emissions from the energy sector sufficiently to be consistent with the 2-degree target of global warming. So it's a significant reduction in energy-related CO2 emissions, down by more than 60% globally. It's a scenario which delivers higher economic growth than the other scenarios. So that combination, lower CO2 emissions, on our way to the 2-degree targets, higher economic growth, means that it's a very nice scenario, something we would all like. The reform scenario, the dark blue, is in terms of outcomes and data and results, the central scenario. It builds on the Paris Agreement, the Paris pledges, the individual countries' promises on what will we deliver, which is the sort of the signed obligations in the agreement. And we assume that those targets will be followed up by measures where the countries will then subsequently deliver on those towards 2025, 2030. And then gradually the policy push steps aside, and you get the markets and technology to be the main driver in the rest of the scenario, and where policy then plays more of a supportive role than what was assumed in the beginning. That scenario is also significant change, much more energy efficient world, very large changes in energy mix, but it does not deliver reductions in CO2 emissions of any significant extent. So it's not sustainable in terms of global warming. The Rivalry Scenario, the orange one, is a scenario which reflects upon the fact that it's not a given that global energy and climate concerns is the main political driver for decision making in business or in policies, that other concerns, other legitimate concerns, might drive policies. At the same time, it's a scenario that reflects on a situation where we have conflicts between different parts of the world. So we might have much lower economic growth. We put sanctions in place to avoid trading with those we don't like to trade with. As a consequence, technology development is slower, economic growth is much slower. The ability to change a huge energy system into something that is sustainable is then also much lower. So that the energy efficiency development is slower, the energy mix change is slower, and the CO2 emissions are much too high. Not a sustainable development, and it's also pockets of the world in that scenario which are not very pleasant to be in. We have a lot of conflict in that scenario, for instance in the Middle East, consequences on immigration, impacts on economic development in Europe as well, as a consequence in that scenario. The drivers that define these scenarios are, or so the dimensions against which we have made these scenarios different, are at least 3. One of them is, I've already mentioned, is sort of to what extent is policy the key driver of the development? That's the renewal scenario. We think that in order to achieve the 2-degree target, we need a massive policy mobilization to drive the development, and then make us as consumers and business tag along and develop technologies and behavior in accordance with the targets. Or is it market-driven? And the reform scenario is an example of something that is more market-driven and less policy-driven. There's a lot of policies there as well, and especially in individual countries, but not to the extent of the renewal scenario. The other dimension, the market dimension, is to what extent do we have a global constructive market organization, free trade, no sanctions, comparative advantage, deciding who produces what and who buys what, openness for trade, all those types of things, where we do not favor our own industries at the expense of others, etc., etc. That's a constructive market rule which characterizes both the renewal and the reform scenario. Or is it a destructive market rule, where we think more of ourselves than others? We withdraw from international trade agreements to protect our own industries. We don't like to trade technology or sell technology to those we don't like. We are concerned with jobs at home. In spite of it being more efficient, we import the services or the goods from somebody who's more productive in developing it. That's a destructive market rule. We don't have a level playing field. We put tariffs in place to guide trade in specific ways. Sounds a bit familiar. If you think so, you believe in the rivalry scenario, at least in the beginning. Then the third dimension, the word on that dimension is not easy to find in English or Norwegian very well, but there's a fantastic German word that characterizes that dimension. That's the Weltanschauung, the way we look at the world, the global outlook. Are we global in our way of looking at the world, we decision makers, politicians? Are we collective? Are we a bit altruistic, precautionary? Do we realize that we're all in the same boat in terms of energy and climate policies, that the things that I do affect you? We think about us. We don't think about us and them. Then you're in the renewal scenario. Kumbaya world, where everybody should want. Or are we nationalist, protectionist, localist? I'm from Bergen in Norway, so I like people from Bergen better than people from Oslo. If I do that too much, then I'm in a rivalry scenario. We put sanctions in place. We think we do beggar than neighbor policies. The things that I do more to have my share of the cake instead of being concerned that the cake is as large as possible and for all of us to share. Well, if you're in that type of tribal, sort of permissive type of political focus, we're moving towards the rivalry scenario. So those are the differences between the scenarios. And then when we play out those dimensions and put different assumptions in place, you get really different outcomes. The number one key for us to be able to deliver on global climate targets is a fantastic improvement in energy efficiency. We have to become, as a globe, much more energy efficient, because with 2.4 billion more people on Earth by 2050, with the next generations being much smarter than us, having much more capital available, having a higher share of female work participation in key countries in the world, the per capita income growth will also be high or positive. So the global economy in these scenarios varies between being twice as large in 2050. Look at the orange exponential line in the central chart. That's the rivalry scenario, close to 2% average growth, twice as rich in 2050. The global economy is twice the current size. Or, in a renewal case, we have 2.7% average economic growth. So the global economy is 2.6 times larger. So with that, the demand for goods, services, and activities that require energy is bound to grow. We will have 3 billion new middle-class consumers, at least, who will demand goods and services and activities that, to start with, require energy. In order to deliver on that in a sustainable manner, we have to do that without significantly increasing the use of energy. That means we have to become much more energy efficient. The last 25 years, look at the black squares to the left, global energy intensity has gone down by an average of 0.9% per year. So that with a GDP growth of 3%, energy demand grows by 2.1. Going forward, in a renewal scenario, we have to deliver an energy intensity which is 60% lower than today. So 2.8% annual improvement in energy intensity, so that we more than compensate for the economic growth. 2.7% per year growth, 2.8% reduction in energy intensity, meaning that energy demand by 2050 is 6% lower than today. A tremendous challenge. And remember that that contains also all the behavioral changes that we have when something becomes more efficient. When something becomes more efficient, we tend to use more of it. We tend to buy a bigger car. We tend to buy the next refrigerator that we buy is much bigger than the other one because it's much more efficient. And by the way, we also use the old refrigerator as a beer cooler in the basement, at least in Scandinavia. So with all that, that's a tremendous challenge. The other scenarios also deliver much better energy intensity than we have done over the last 25 years. Fortunately, we see some signals over the last years that that might actually happen. But it has to happen, otherwise we can forget the 2-degree target. The second challenge that we have to deliver on is to speed up the change in the energy mix globally. And it hardly is changing at the moment. In spite of a fantastic development and great revolution in the cost development of renewable electricity, solar panels and windmills, we have 200 times more solar panels on Earth now than we had 15 years back. The result of that revolution, and all the windmills in Texas and Germany and Denmark, is that pink sliver at the top of the 2014 column. So new renewable electricity delivers less than 2% of total primary energy demand today. Fossil fuels, which were 88% of the energy mix in 1970, has been above 80% throughout the last 25 years, still 81%. Gas takes a bit of market share from oil. The coal demand has gone up from 2000 to 2014 because of the development in China, the first 10 years of this millennium. Going forward, so the decarbonization hasn't started yet. It has to start, and it has to speed up rapidly. And look at the changes in the energy mix across the scenarios. They're all big changes. A lot of new renewable electricity in all the scenarios. If you look at the renewal, what we have to do there, that's a paradigm shift. We have to get to 20% new renewable electricity, so that's solar panels and windmills, by 2050. And we have to take the coal share of the energy mix down from 30 to 10%. And given that energy demand is roughly constant, that means reducing coal at the absolute level of coal demand by 2/3. That's necessary to deliver on the 2-degree target. If you think that's impossible, then I challenge everybody to come up with something that is more realistic. Not necessarily likely, but more realistic. When we look out the window, and we all have the benefit of being in a country in the world where we might actually see it. But when we look out the window, we see a couple of potential candidates for being able to deliver on this change. One of them, light-duty vehicles. They could be electrified completely, more or less, by 2050. They have to be electrified more or less completely by 2050 if we are to deliver on the 2-degree target. When I say we are located in Norway, you can actually see this happening. But that change is stimulated by fantastic consumer subsidies. No other country in the world can possibly afford to grant such subsidies to people who want to buy an electric car. But the technology development is going rapidly. The car producers promise and have to deliver a new range of cars, many models on electricity by 2025 in order to be satisfying their emission standards, emission requirements on their fleet. If it happens, and these cars might, as a result of that, be competitive on a cost-performance basis by 2025, at least for all of us who do not require to drive 800 kilometers in 4 hours, which are the Germans. But they might actually buy electric vehicles there as well. So if that happens, so you could have a 50% share, why would anybody buy anything else? Living in a city like Paris with local pollution, stimulated by the mayor of Paris to say that, I don't like it when you buy a diesel car. If it is cost competitive on a price performance basis, why would you buy anything else? If that happens, we could have 50% of the global new car sales in 2030 being electric, and then 90% in 2050. And then we basically take out a lot of the demand for oil in that sector, which is 1/4 of global oil demand, 25 million barrels, light-duty vehicles. But we don't see it anywhere yet. Note also that the other thing we have to do in that scenario is to avoid that the increase in population, the increase in income in the parts of the world where the car density is low and the population is growing and is high already, leads to new car sales growing rapidly. We have 80 million new cars being sold today. We have almost the same in the renewal scenario in 2050. That's a really radical assumption. What that assumes is that, first of all, that many of the cars being sold are shared. So we don't need as many cars, but the problem, of course, is if they drive much, you have the same type of energy use. The second most important thing about that is that we have urban structures. We have cities. The new cities in Asia, in particular, have to be built in a manner where you can survive or have a good middle-class life without necessarily using a car. Otherwise, the car fleet will become too big. So we need urban structures, public transportation system, railroads, tubes, metros. We have cities that cannot look like Houston or Atlanta. The new cities in Asia must look more like what some of the cities over there already look like, or like Barcelona and Paris. Compact cities built for public transportation. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough challenge. Then decarbonizing or electrifying car fleets in China and Poland and other countries that have a lot of coal in their electricity mix too rapidly is a bad idea. But fortunately, the second item or the second potential change we see that could deliver on the 2-degree target is happening in front of our eyes in terms of new renewable electricity. And it has to happen rapidly and sizably. So the decarbonization of electricity is also an absolutely necessary ingredient, we think, in a 2-degree scenario. Today, 2% of total primary energy demand is delivered by windmills and solar panels, 5% of global electricity. Because electricity is roughly 19% of the total final energy consumption. It's not 80% or 100. It sometimes sounds like that when we have these debates. It's 19. Going forward, solar panels and windmills might deliver up to 50% of global electricity. They have to deliver 50% of global electricity in our 2-degree scenario. 60% in North America, 60% in Europe, roughly 50% in China, 45% in India, in order for us to be able to get CO2 emissions sufficiently down. And we hardly have any coal. We have a little bit of coal and gas generation left. We have more capacity of gas probably in 2050, relatively speaking, because we need gas as backup, but it won't produce all the time. And we have carbon capture and storage on quite a bit of the remaining coal-fired generation in order to achieve the targets. In terms of carbon capture and storage, we're less optimistic than many others have been who made 2-degree consistent scenarios with the IPCC report some years back. We do not see that developing going very fast. In spite of, in this scenario, having a very high carbon price, we think we will end up with, in that scenario, we have to end up with 1.5 billion tons of carbon capture and storage in total. If you are less optimistic on energy efficiency, less optimistic on the ability to decarbonize the electricity sector, then you have to be more optimistic on carbon capture and storage. And 1.5 billion tons globally doesn't sound like a whole lot, but we've tried for years to develop a full-scale plant at our biggest refinery, which would take out 1 million tons post-combustion per year. We haven't made it yet. We might make it, but we haven't made it happen yet. If we do, we have to build one of those every 8th day from now to 2050 to come to 1.5 billion tons. So carbon capture, those that rely on tens of billions of tons or 5 billion tons of carbon capture and storage have to try and explain how that is going to happen. What is it that's going to drive that development? We think more of decarbonization of electricity. And then we 40 double solar generation, 13 double wind generation. And the electricity share of the global economy goes from 19% to close to 30%. So we double the rate of electrification compared to historical numbers. The reason why we focus a lot on those two sectors, I've talked about light-duty vehicles and electricity, is not that we do not think changes will happen in the rest of the energy sector, but we think it's going to be more difficult. Partly because the demand for the services and goods and activities from those sectors is growing and is following GDP growth. To the left, we have the part of transportation that is not light-duty vehicles. So everything that is more than 3.5 tons and moves is there. That's railroads, ships, it's trucks, and it's aircraft. We might have 3 times as many aircraft flying in 2050 as we do today. If you look at the development in the number of Chinese traveling internationally the last 15 years, and you were to think that exponential growth rate were to continue until 2050, we don't. But if that happened, we would have 23 billion movements of Chinese in and out of the country by 2050. That's a lot of underlying demand for aircraft. So if you have up to a tripling of the aircraft traffic, we will have a lot more efficient airplanes. There will be more biofuels in the fuel, but they will still use a lot of oil. With the assumptions on urban transport, we're going to have a lot more public transport. We're going to have gas in shipping. We're going to have electrified buses somewhere. We're going to have much more efficient trucks, maybe electrified some of those trucks as well, but we're going to have a lot more trucking. When you have 3 billion new middle-class consumers wanting to go to IKEA every Saturday to buy stuff, we need a lot more trucking transport. So the transport work will increase. And doing that, as we do in a renewal scenario, with constant energy use is a tremendous performance and a tremendous challenge. But it has to be delivered. And then on the right side, we have everything else. Everything that is not transport and electricity generation. That is the final energy consumption mix in the rest of the energy sector. That's direct gas used for heating and for cooking. It's the use of gas and oil and coal to generate the energy we need to do all kinds of manufacturing processes. It's the direct use of oil and gas and coal as feedstock in manufacturing processes like petrochemical industry. The latter part is a growth component. We will need more plastic by 2050, need more polymers. If we can decarbonize the electricity use and make it, or the energy use associated with transforming oil and gas into plastics, then we have solved the CO2 problem, because we don't burn the oil and gas when it becomes the chair you were sitting on or the wall-to-wall carpet you have your feet on. But we need oil and gas to produce it. Try living a day of your life without oil and gas. Who brushed their teeth this morning? You used oil and gas both for the toothbrush and in the toothpaste, right? Some of the audience put on cosmetics. Can't do that if you don't have oil and gas. And you're sitting on an oil and gas chair. If you didn't have oil and gas, you wouldn't have a car in the garage either, because a lot of it's made of polymers. And you wouldn't have a road to drive on. So we need that, and that's a growth component. It's not huge compared to the otherwise, but it's something that makes sure that we don't get oil and gas demand to go to zero. We need a lot of steel in the windmills, steel and in railroad tracks. Steel is iron and coal. So there is a component of growth. But there's a significant change, and look at, we use less energy also in the rest of the sectors. By 2050, we use much more electricity, even though we are 2.5 times richer, 2.4 million people more. And then finally, one of the reasons why Statoil as an energy company in our strategy talks about investing much more in new renewables, but also continue to invest in oil and gas. This is one of the reasons. My boss didn't like it when he asked me, what's oil demand going to be in 2050? And as Adam indicated, any kind of forecast is wrong. But I said, on one hand, it could be 63 million barrels. That's the renewal scenario, the light blue square in 2050. Or 123. Thank you for that precise forecast. Plus minus 30% compared to what the level is today. But if you stick to the 63, which is the lowest oil demand we have here, and then you think about, what if we stopped spending any money, any brain capacity, any capital in the oil and gas industry, with the exception of maintaining the facilities that currently produce oil and gas? We didn't drill in a single well, we didn't do anything in terms of water injection, IOR, whatever. Oil production would fall by 3 to 6% per year, probably even more. If it does that, you might end up with producing 10 million barrels per day in 2050, 6% decline if that's the number. And the demand is 63. So we need 53 million barrels per day in 2050 of something that doesn't produce today, new oil. That has to come from resources that we know, but we have to invest in order to get them out. IOR, exploration. And if you accumulate that over the whole period, so you do the integral under the curve, which some of my analysts know how to do, I've forgotten it. The white space there plus the gray shaded area, how much oil do we need to produce that comes from something that doesn't produce today? That's the top of the light blue part of the column in the left chart. That's 510 billion barrels. Doesn't sound much, or sounds a lot, but if you compare it with something, I like to compare it. We think OPEC has produced quite a bit of oil the last 35 years, agree? Roughly 1/3 of the global market. In total, they produced 375 billion barrels. That's a gray column. So we might need 50% more the next 35 years coming from something that doesn't produce today than OPEC has produced the last 35 years. In a scenario which is consistent with the 2-degree target. If you don't believe that scenario, you think the demand is going to be higher, the challenge is even bigger. one of the reasons why we continue to look for oil and gas. One of the reasons why we continue to invest in oil and gas. We want to, and we think it's not sustainable to say that we're not going to fill that wide gap. And if you think oil is difficult, this is a story for gas. The demand is going down there too in that scenario by 15%, 14, 15%. The white gap is big. The gray shaded area is big. It's probably easier to pinpoint where those resources are, but we still need to invest a lot in order to find them and get them out of the ground. And the numbers, some 70 trillion standard cubic meters from something that doesn't produce today. And when you look at the combined production of the United States, Russia, and the Middle East in terms of gas over the last 35 years, that's at least the 4 largest gas producers, Iran and Qatar, the United States and Russia. We need 50% more than what they have produced in combination the last 35 years, over the next 35. So this is not about moving from oil and gas to renewable electricity. This is about doing all three a lot, investing a lot in sufficient amounts of energy, and at the same time getting the energy mix right. The only thing we do not need to invest a lot in is coal. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eirik. One of the points that you made, in fact, it was in those last 2 slides, is that even with a peaking in total use of oil and gas, there's still a big supply gap that exists because of the decline in existing production. I think in your rivalry scenario, you have oil and gas demand still rising all the way out to 2050. But in the renewables and reform scenarios, you have peaks in renewal. In the renewal scenario, it's very soon. I mean, it's the next decade, early.
Early, in 5 years.
In 5 years, so 2022. And in the reform scenario, it's around the year 2030. So if we take the renewable scenario, which is the one that you'd like to see, I mean, as you started off saying, that's the one that you love the best.
That's the one we all should like to see.
What kind of strategy, whether it's in the upstream or downstream, does it make sense for a company to pursue, knowing that the possibility exists that for oil, a peak could be coming soon, and for natural gas, it could be a few years later? What do you do?
Well, I think if you look at the strategy regarding oil or gas, the smart thing to do is to ensure that we're cost competitive in what we do.
Right.
And that means you can make price estimates here, but what is definite is that the producer price of oil and gas is going to be on average lower, much lower, in a renewal scenario than in reform and rivalry. So that means that the costs of what we invest in have to be lower than what the price might be in that scenario. So that's having as low cost as possible. And when you look at what the industry has done now, we have fields now in the Barents Sea that we might make an investment decision on, that where 3 years ago we thought the break-even price requirement was $80 a barrel. And then we've delivered cost reductions now that so when we're ready to make that decision, the break-even price will be 35. And that's happened all over the industry. So being cost competitive, that's one thing. Do the things we do, but with a low cost. The other thing that we are looking for, and which is one of the reasons why we probably also have to continue to explore, is that carbon efficiency in your production also will become a competitive parameter, or a parameter that allows us to compete. Because in that scenario, we have first of all we're going to be faced with a carbon price that rapidly increases to 100 and then beyond dollars per ton. So being carbon efficient, which means also that looking for the resources that don't require a lot of energy to be extracted, which is one of the challenges with oil sands and heavy oil in Venezuela, as an example, is that you require a lot of energy to get it out. So we're looking for resources that are, light sweet crudes beautifully coming out by the reservoirs by themselves. They're not easy to find, by the way, but so that's the other strategy. So for oil and gas.
There's a gap. Somebody's going to fill it, and we want our company to be the one that fills that gap. It's an interesting idea that low cost would help you do that. I think that one of the other things that occurs to me is that that if we did see a peak in demand for oil, it would vary across regions. So possibly in the United States, possibly in Europe, oil demand peaks, but
it has
but
already
not
peaked.
necessarily
It has already
everywhere
peaked.
else, right?
In the OECD area, it probably
Right.
peaked in 2005.
And it
I
has
think.
in Japan,
Yeah.
right? So you look for downstream opportunities in those places where you think demand is still rising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the good thing about the oil market is that it's global. It's not as important as in the gas markets, and particularly in the electricity market. It's not as important where you produce or where you deliver the oil compared to where it's demanded, because there's a global market there. But what creates interesting challenges in that type of dynamic is that where are the refineries going to be? And the refineries we might have to invest in refineries in Asia, while at the same time we dismantle refineries here or in Europe. So that's another part of the industry which creates an interesting dynamic, but which is more of a manufacturing type of decision, and you have to invest whatever. If then also the supply of oil turns out to be the wrong quality, and in this renewal scenario, the change in the fuel mix there at the end of this is we don't have the models to do that in detail, but when you look at it, the remaining oil demand is going to be a lot of jet fuels. There's going to be gasoline, relatively light fuels. And then if the oil quality that we end up finding is extra heavy, sour, a lot of sulfur, whatever, then there's also the requirements for refining it might be tougher than if it were different. Which is also one of the reasons why we should also continue to look for light sweet crudes that don't require as much refining.
Right.
To fit
Shale
the
gives
quality.
a lot of light sweet crude. Shale
Yeah.
would be ideal for that. But an interesting question would be if that doesn't really come about until the year 2040 or 2050, even the prolific resource base in the U.S. for oil shale, at least EIA's forecasts don't have the resource base lasting that long. Now, they could be wrong about that too, but maybe it goes to 2035 in some of the models that I've seen at EIA. That's an interesting question. Is this the third perspectives that you've had a direct hand in, or?
No, it's the seventh. That
You've
I've had
done all
a
seven?
direct hand in, but I guess my responsibility has increased over the last 4 years. It's been my responsibility.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking three or four. What's changed? What have been the most dramatic changes in the perspectives and what the results have been over the last 3 or if you want to go 7 years, over the time period that you've been involved in it most directly?
No, a couple of things. I think first of all, if you look over the whole period, there's been a gradual sort of maturation of our way of thinking in actually trying to model these very different scenarios. And we didn't dare to try and do the 2-degree scenario 4 years back. But over the last 3-4 years, we've done that, and that's when you start to see how challenging it is. So that's the way we've been working, has been changing. Of course, the biggest surprises when you update every year your data set, you get surprises, and you see that your forecast for the next year is also wrong. Not to talk about what's going to happen in 2040 or 2050. And the big surprises there has, of course, been the continued very rapid development in renewable electricity. And the question is when does that turn into an S-curve? The biggest surprise of the last couple of years has been this fantastic cost reduction that we've seen in oil and gas, which has been much higher than the corresponding cost reduction, or much more than the corresponding cost reduction in renewable electricity in the same period. The negative surprise was that when IEA most recently updated their data, the CO2 emission levels, particularly in China, are higher than what we thought. Going a little bit back, which means that the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is higher than we thought, and the challenge of reaching any kind of 2-degree target becomes larger. What is not surprising but disappointing is the continued fantastic ability among politicians to talk about climate targets, but the continued disability to do anything about them, to put measures in place that actually would deliver. So it was very nice, a very good surprise that the Paris Agreement was ratified by so many so rapidly. But it is disappointing that we're still not seeing significant signals about actually changing policies to drive us in the right direction. And that's sort of the renewal scenario here illustrates the necessity of rapid change also on that parameter. I mean, in order to be able to have a peak oil demand by 2022, 2023, we better get going on tightening some of the targets. There's a lot of good things happening, both on the technology side, and also there are a lot of good emission standards out there, but more things have to be done. We can't continue with record high gasoline sales in the US like we had last year. We can't continue with 38% of the new cars in China being SUVs as they were last year. And then at the same time have a hope that we have a peak oil demand by 2022, 23.
So one of the comments that I would often see at EIA is, why don't your forecasts show greater movement towards electric vehicles, for example? And the answer from our modelers was consumer preference. That what they found was that consumers preferred SUVs when gasoline was cheap. You as an economist...
I'm waiting for my plug-in 4x4 SUV. They do exist.
If we had that breakthrough in battery technology that drove the costs down, that made that kind of a vehicle attractive, it would be an interesting one. Is there a Jevons paradox problem here in economics? Jevons studied coal in the United Kingdom 200 years ago, maybe. Somebody can help me out with the dates. And the theory was that as you drove costs down, you actually ended up, as you improved efficiency, you actually tended to consume more. You got a bounce back from the improvements in efficiency that led you to produce more because it created economic growth and wealth and that kind of thing. If you don't have fuel efficiency rules, if you don't have a carbon tax, and if these breakthroughs that we're seeing in oil and gas drilling costs coming down, conventional crude decline curves may be flattening. We're seeing a little bit of that. It sounds like that could drive oil and gas prices down, which then makes it even more attractive to use oil and gas. How does something like that feedback loop fit into a forecast like Statoil?
That is. I mean, there's a recent study now of all the EU countries, the EU 28 countries, indicating that the rebound effect, the change in consumer behavior when something more energy efficient comes along, the average rebound effect is 75%. So you only keep 25% of the original saving. Right? And that's because we use things more, we leave the lights on longer when we have cheap LED light bulbs, et cetera, et cetera. We buy a bigger car when the engine becomes much more efficient. So that means that we need, in order to achieve any energy efficiency along the lines that we thought, we need 4 times the improvement, right? So in order to avoid that from driving the development and ensure the type of energy intensity development that we have here, we do need a set of, we think we need a set of measures that together drive that development to affect consumers. Because you're right, I mean, it's the consumers that decide. We can discuss the supply changes in the energy sector as much as we like, but it's the consumers' decisions that decide how much energy we use. And then it's the fuel efficiency standards. It's taxes. You guys here in the United States have to start paying a tax on gasoline. We have to eliminate all fossil fuel subsidies around the world. That ensures that in many countries in the OPEC area, the consumer price is below the producer cost, right? Because it's subsidized. So we need all that. We also probably need, or we definitely need, a way of organizing future electricity systems where we depend a lot on zero marginal cost types of production, like wind and solar. We have to think about how to organize those, not only to provide incentives for somebody to invest in those markets, but also to provide incentives for all of us to save on electricity. Otherwise, we will have to build a lot of inefficient capacity where we could use that. We could use those money and resources much more efficiently elsewhere. So in a household that has a solar panel on the roof, how do you ensure that when we have too much sun and the battery is full in the car, which is your storage facility in the basement, how do you ensure that the extra electricity is offloaded to the grid instead of just turning up the heat or turning up the air conditioning or whatever? And so those types of incentive mechanisms have to be put in place all over. And we don't have that at the moment.
One of the factors in thinking about your scenarios, the Trump administration has just announced its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Now there's questions about exactly how long it will take to do that, but clearly the sympathy doesn't lie in moving in the direction of your renewal scenario. It sounds more like your rivalry scenario.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I guess there is a number of thoughts that you could talk about on that one. Of course, it's given the positive momentum that the Paris Agreement entailed, the fact that it was rapidly ratified by almost everybody, the signal of withdrawing this soon is negative. It will probably postpone some changes that are overdue. We're moving too slowly and we don't need further delays. In terms of actual outcome for it, it probably won't have a long-term impact on the US CO2 emissions. A bit of the paradox is that the United States is one of the countries in the world that has actually delivered the best development in terms of CO2 emissions over the last decade. Mainly driven by markets, the availability of cheap gas forcing out coal, in some sense in spite of federal policies. But also helped along by efficiency standards and emission standards, helped along by some local standards. And the good thing about a federal state like the United States is that at state level, states are free to continue with a lot of the sort of Paris conducive policies. So if they do that, then also the impact short term might not be negative. On the global scene, you could foresee a bit of reactions both ways among other countries. Some regions or countries could step up to the plate and perceive this as a potential to take leadership roles globally more efficiently than before. China, EU being examples, especially if it's in their own interest, especially if it's perceived to be a positioning where we could take a leadership role in other areas if the United States is perceived to pull back from that type of global leadership role. Then you could have other countries using the opportunity to say that if the United States don't want to do this, then we're not going to do it either. So it's both. What worries me a bit is the smaller part of this, but it's sort of one thing that is necessary in this renewal scenario is that we seriously start discussing how to share the burden. How do we in the rich world ensure the delivery of the emerging economy's energy demand, satisfaction of the energy demand, and at the same time deliver the type of energy mix? There's bound to be a lot of burden sharing here. If you have a carbon tax of $150 per ton, that's a lot of income in some countries, and there's a lot of loss of revenues in some key emerging economies. Mm-hmm. How do we ensure that happening? And then in the Paris Agreement, this financing tool, which is too small, but it's very important, for instance, for ensuring that India is achieving its targets. The United States withdrawing undermines the credibility of that type of funding mechanism, and that's something that worries me a bit. But other than that, it's just a wait and see. But we don't need a delay. We need an acceleration.
It's not easy to do in a society, and I think in many cases globally, where thinking about tomorrow, literally tomorrow, is more important to most people than thinking about what might happen 40 or 50 years from now, and very high discount rates. To the extent that you do worry about the long term, the amount of capital that you're willing to put towards that can be pretty low. So it's going to be a challenge. It's not going to be an easy thing to do. It would obviously, the renewable scenario makes a huge difference in the direction that the energy future takes. One of the comments that was in the press release from Statoil when you issued this was that something like 15 or 20% of the new capital investments by the year 2030 would be in low carbon or renewables technology. Could you give us some examples of what that might look like? How does an oil and gas company do that? What do you become?
Yeah, well, we definitely then become an energy company. And we and other IOCs are moving in that direction. This is where I now move out of the analytical report and move into the sharpened Statoil strategy. And we have signaled that by 2030, 15 to 20% of our capex might be in new energy solutions, low carbon, zero carbon type of energy. It could be decarbonizing methane into hydrogen, solar, wind. It has to be profitable. That's why it might be 15 to 20%. But so does oil and gas, right? I mean, companies like Statoil, we do not invest in things that we do not think might be profitable.
Right.
We do not have the mandate to do that. Examples of what it is today is that we are a large offshore wind producer. We think we're pretty good at some of the key aspects of offshore wind, which is marine operations, it's marine maintenance, it's the ability to move these huge windmills out there, it's the ability to have people go on these windmills when they're offshore and maintain them and so on. And we do that relatively successfully. We're large in the UK. We will develop an offshore wind plant east of Manhattan, south of Long Island. So that's an example of what we will be doing.
Right.
We're piloting floating windmills now in a location in Scotland. That's interesting for the countries where the continental shelf is too deep to have anything on ground, like Japan, California, maybe India. We are doing venture investments in different parts of the renewable energy spectrum. We're into solar, and then we'll see what it is. It's a kind of and we think we have competencies to develop that. I think what is often overestimated is that or underestimated, if you like, undercommunicated, is that the technology challenges that we have in oil and gas are probably much bigger than what takes place in the renewable electricity spectrum. It's a little bit different, but taking out oil and gas at 4,000 meters below at the 2,500 meter sea depth, and then basically bring out extra heavy sour oil. The technology challenges there are huge compared to renewable electricity. So we think we have the technology competence. And then it's a bit about doing the things that we know how to do operational wise, doing it in cooperation with other companies and so on. And Statoil in Scandinavia is a big company. We are probably the biggest renewable electricity company as well.
Right.
At the moment, with the offshore wind we have in the UK.
The offshore wind comment, Sarah Ladislaw, who directs the energy program here at CSIS, commented earlier with a smile that isn't it refreshing that a company with a lot of experience in offshore technology is actually engaged now in doing offshore wind rather. It's like, well, all right. I do recall that they were having a great deal of difficulty getting the wheel in London raised up, and they actually called on Shell and their technology and heavy lift to assist with that after having failed the first time with some people that didn't know a lot about doing things like that. There are a lot of skill sets in the oil industry.
Shell built and we operate the biggest object ever moved by man.
And that is?
That's the Troll A gas platform in Norway. It's
Right.
455,000 tons, I think. And we moved it out of a narrow fjord, and we had to turn it. And then when we moved it out of the wide fjord, we had 5 to 6 meters below it. If we missed, it would be there still. And now it's so I understand why they called on. They could have called on Shell or us.
It would be called a reef.
Exactly. It would have been a bad mistake at work. I miscalculated.
You know, it's really interesting. I sometimes think that people don't understand the level of effort and technology that goes into delivering energy, you know, turning on the switch. Where does that electricity really come from? How do you get a gallon of gasoline to your car? The amount of effort it really requires to deliver that is amazing. There was a poll in the Washington Post news article a few days ago saying that a sizable percentage, it might have been 7 or 8% of the people polled said that they thought chocolate milk came from brown cows. And, and I was thinking, wow, and now I've got to explain carbon taxes to somebody. This is not going to be easy.
But just imagine all the energy associated with filling that milk with the brown powder when it comes from the tropics, right?
All right, I think it's time to turn this over to our guests here today to see what kinds of questions they might have. You know, I failed at the beginning of this of our presentation this afternoon to remind everybody that if there is a fire drill, the easiest way to get out of our building is the stairs over here on this side and go out the front door. There are exits to the back as well. We're not expecting a fire drill, but by golly, Sarah reminded me one time that they were up on the 9th floor and they actually got a hurricane warning. I mean, the sky went completely black and there was a tornado warning and they had to evacuate the 9th floor of the building here. So, you know, things do happen. So be advised of that. Now, with that warm up, why don't we see, now, the rules here are please identify yourself, wait for the microphone, and please try to raise your voice at the end or kind of put a question mark on your question. There's a gentleman up here, the fellow with the blue shirt. Let's start with him.
Okay. My name is Dalton Booker. I'm here representing the Osgood Institute for International Studies, and I was just kind of curious to hear your thoughts. There's been a lot of progress forward in the fusion industry. You know, there's a lot of brilliant men and women in Europe working on that at the ITER. I was just curious to hear your thoughts because that was obviously absent from your forecast for the future because it is a non-existent technology right now. So just curious as to what your thoughts on fusion are.
Do you have any thoughts on fusion? I mean, that would mess up the renewables forecast.
Yeah, sure. Definitely. First of all, what I should have mentioned was and some of you might have observed it, is that we have a higher share of nuclear electricity in the renewable scenario than we have today.
Right.
We think that in order to move out of fossil fuels in the electricity sector, in particular in the Middle East and in Asia, we cannot only rely on renewables. So we will see some growth in nuclear there. Declines elsewhere.
Renewables won't be base load everywhere.
No.
Okay.
That could be different forms of traditional nuclear. We have not modeled sort of large-scale cold fusion type of things. That if that happens, that's a type of black swan that would change everything in terms of the electricity mix here, right? It would take out all the windmills and the solar panels and replace that by something else. But we haven't done that. But it's a black swan. When I was much younger than you are, it was still 40 years ahead of us, and it might still be, and that's why we stopped in 2050. Right?
So hot
but
fusion,
it could happen.
right.
It's one of the black swans that
Right.
is out there. Yeah.
Hot fusion. So we're very close actually to the build out of the joint European, U.S., Japanese, Russian. I think it's Tokamak hot fusion project. So that's been underway for decades.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll see. But I suspect there might be somebody here in the room that knows more about that than I do. But it's probably going to take a while before we get even
and
any
what's
kind
the energy
of
density
results
there?
from that.
What's the energy output compared to the energy input? I mean, that's
Right.
the key question.
Don't know. In the back, Jan.
I'm Jan Mayers with Resources for the Future. Thank you for a very sobering set of scenarios, and thank you also to your company for being one of the oil companies that's supporting the idea of a price on carbon. Thinking about the challenges that all those scenarios present for the goal that I think you all and most of the people in the room, if not everybody, feel, I wonder whether we're at a stage where we've got to start thinking more about adaptation. And are you thinking about it, and should we be thinking about it?
There is research going on in terms of adaptation. There's just a recent update by a Japanese set of researchers running the general equilibrium models used by the IPCC. Made some updates on that, and where they start to compare the costs of mitigation with the costs of adaptation with different scenarios. If you have, and in particular if you have very inefficient ways of achieving the targets, then the cost of mitigation might be high. In our scenario, renewal scenario, we assume that a set of relatively efficient types of measures which for a period reduces economic growth, but then after that delivers higher economic growth, so there's no net costs, if you like. But if we have very inefficient policies, like we do at the moment, and if we were to go in that direction, then the question about adaptation versus mitigation becomes more relevant. If we think when we see that we will arrive at the wrong point in terms of CO2 emissions, then that discussion will also have to come up. And the research that these Japanese researchers showed was they compared with a well below and a 1.5 and a 2-degree scenario with different assumptions on the policies of getting there. Their optimal scenario delivers 2.5 because the cost of mitigation is less than the extra cost of adaptations. But there's something also here about I think efficiency in terms of measures is the most important, because given all the uncertainty in what we're talking about, spending a lot of time discussing the finer details of decimal points variation in temperature by 2100 is probably a waste of energy, to put it that way. And I think the key message is that we have to do everything we can to become more energy efficient. We have to do everything we can to allow people in the emerging economies to get out of things that are locally polluting as well, and that means go out of coal. That means to transfer from the very polluting biomass, which happens to be sustainable in terms of a CO2 equation, but it has to be go out of that. And if distributed solar or wind energy can deliver that, then that's good for the better good anyway. This is about doing the right things and not doing all the right things. It's about avoiding the goal of the best, becoming the enemy of the good. So, but definitely, and it's also a very difficult discussion to have when it's sort of perceived as a 0-1 situation. Either we achieve the CO2 reductions or the world collapses. But the adaptation discussion needs to take place in a setting where where it's a matter of costs. It's a matter of handling changes. But that is very difficult. But I think we have to start doing something, and then we can do that discussion once we get there. That provoked some people, I think.
Mark?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Eirik. Mark Finley with BP. And so I had a question about when you were talking about the renewal scenario, the one that we all want. You characterized it as policy-driven, and you had your reform scenario as market-driven. And when you talked about the specific policies, to get you onto the renewal world, you were talking about fuel efficiency standards, incentives for restructuring the power system, urban planning and dense cities. I mean, should I take away from this that you don't think that a pricing of carbon is sufficient to get you to a 2-degree outcome, and that other policy interventions are needed on top of that?
Yes. We need other things as well. But we might need less of it once the carbon price has come up to sufficient levels. But in order to get these things right relatively quickly, we need to continue with tightening fuel efficiency standards. We need to continue to subsidize technology development in parts of the energy spectrum as well. Correct the market, if you like. We need to correct the market mechanism through policy measures like the carbon tax or carbon adjustment tax across the borders and so on. But we also need other types of instruments, traditional policies, because some of these things will not go by themselves.
There is an interesting mathematical calculation. If you have a standard across the board carbon tax, pick a number, $40, a metric ton. That would be a very significant charge in the electric coal business, but it really wouldn't make that much of a difference even in the United States or Europe on oil. Every dollar per ton carbon charge is worth about a penny a gallon, so even a $40 a ton carbon price would raise gasoline prices 40 cents, which might not make that much difference in the US, would probably make no difference at all in places like Europe and Japan that already have higher taxes. So some kind of fuel efficiency standards on automobiles or diesel trucks might still make sense, I guess, to come into that. Whether the politics, will enable you to do that. One of the beauties, I think, of the carbon tax, at least in many people's minds, is, oh, great, we just put a price on carbon and we're done. Seems like a very attractive concept to economists, but maybe it doesn't really work as well as you would think. This gentleman right here on the aisle.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Philip Cornell at the Atlantic Council, previously at Saudi Aramco and at the IEA. I want to talk a little bit about the oil market in particular. You mentioned a little bit about downward pressures on cost in the industry, but specifically about sort of price dynamics. I mean, given sort of what we've seen in LTO sort of project costs and lead times, the same things going on the conventional side. There's some kind of argument that, and also what we see, for example, in OPEC and I would say in Saudi, some kind of move towards a more sort of view of oil as a commodification of oil, if you like, sort of pumping full out rather than keeping spare capacity. There's some kind of argument for greater volatility and different price dynamics going forward, let's say, particularly in the near-term side of your forecast, let's say over the next 10 years. So how do you see those price dynamics changing? Do you think there's going to be greater volatility as a rule? And how do you see that affecting, let's say, supply response to demand or different behaviors of actors in the market in that kind of scenario? Thanks.
No, generally, of course, the situation at the moment is extremely uncertain in the sense that we don't know the long-term, more structural effects of what has been going on in the industry over the last 2-3 years in terms of cost reductions. We haven't seen the impact of the investment cuts, the fight against decline on long-term production and decline rates. So, there's a lot of uncertainty there as well. In terms of if you look at what we believe sort of over the more longer term here, and you take these scenarios as the starting point, what we think is that the rivalry scenario here is the one that is characterized by factors that are most likely to drive prices up and down. Cyclicality at least, and maybe even more volatility as well, because that's a typical scenario where you would have supply disruptions in key producing countries. You could have a lot of the normal supply side variation. In the renewal scenario, which is a sort of a smooth kumbaya world, everything moving in the right direction slowly, definitely you're still going to have cyclicality in prices, and you're going to have, all the actors that are financial players in the oil market, which tend to move the prices sometimes in the opposite direction of what fundamentals would indicate, will still be there. The key, one of the key uncertainties in that scenario is what happens in a market where you face declining top-line demand. How do actors act then? Because there's still, as I said, as I've tried to argue, that there's a huge supply gap still, right, or demand gap, depending on which way of the equation you count. But so we have to invest a lot. But top-line demand is definitely starting to fall at some point. And what's the price implication of that? And frankly, we don't know. Who's going to play against that by, okay, I'm going to maximize the value of my remaining reserves, I'm not going to explore more. And then you can get a lot of volatility in that scenario too.
One of the questions that you were asked coming in here, Eirik, was could we be facing a lithium cartel in the year 2030 that would create volatility in renewable prices?
Yeah, well, at least I think we should seriously think about the notion that all the stuff that we have to put into our renewable electricity system, combined with all the batteries that we're going to have in the cars and elsewhere, that is sort of a renewable eternal resource. It isn't. We might need 25 times as much lithium as we do today. That's what we need in our renewal scenario in order to have all the batteries. Or we might need something else. There's a lot more copper in an electric society in running electric vehicles and windmills. So how does the demand, the increasing demand for rare earth minerals increase if we are going to make these batteries larger, bigger, and more of them, and continue that type of cost development? And that's a big uncertainty. I mean, 60% of the world's cobalt is produced in Congo, and the Chinese companies have bought a lot of cobalt mine owning companies. So that's an interesting, and we will probably find something else. But if we need more, if we run out of lithium, then we're back to the challenge of having much less energy dense batteries, other minerals. So that whole, I read in the paper that there's an open pit mine in California now that is reopening because it was shut down some years back because they were expecting an increase in the price of the minerals that they can produce. So it's and FT had an article about a copper mine in Arizona now building a second shaft, 3,000 meters, 2,500 meters deep, in expectations of higher copper prices, using a lot of water in the production. I'm not so sure that's sustainable in Arizona to have a lot of water mining. So
this is really good career news for energy economists and commodity analysts.
Yes. Go out and find the price of lithium in 2050.
Other questions here? Let's hands up. How about? I don't see anybody over here. Come on. How about? Why don't I see any? Why is it only men that want to ask questions at these meetings? Come on. One of the women must have a question. I'm going to let you think about that and put your hand up. Jamie, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. One of your graphs showed that outside of light-duty vehicles for transportation, you don't see any peak at all, as you mentioned, people going to IKEA a whole lot more. But there has been obviously this move with the IMO regulations and others to try to lighten that. There's been moves by Amazon and others to try to move towards drones or anything. There's also been moves and some discussion on additive manufacturing. What role, if anything, do you see where that you could potentially move some demand out of there in what is otherwise, as you can see, a very sticky part of the demand side of the barrel?
Yeah, well, actually, we have peak oil demand in the remaining transportation sector, but just towards the end, right? So we have the slightly declining demand in the renewable sector in the renewable scenario for all types of transportation. We could be wrong. I mean, you could foresee something even more extreme, if you like, because it is really extreme when you think about it. If you start in the other direction, what's the demand for transport going to be when you have a very low car density in the parts of the world where population is increasing and the income growth is increasing? If you look at the rise or the increase in vehicle density in India and China alone the last 15 years, the numbers don't look very fantastic. But if you multiply it by their population, we have 800 million more cars today than we had 15 years ago. And India's economy might be 8 times as large, 7.7 in our figures by 2050. So the demand for transportation, unless we have a very different development, and probably India is going to be is so heavily populated that it won't be the same type of demand for a car as in Houston. And the same thing with air traffic, with trucking transporting the goods. If you don't, and some people say also we're speculating a bit about 3D printing. It's going to eliminate a lot of transportation. Well, somebody's got to print the printers or move them out, and we have to deliver the raw materials into the printers to make. But all those types of technology developments are probably implicitly within our scenario already. Delivering the amount of transport needed to 2.4 billion more people flying maybe 3 times as much as we do today. And doing that without increasing the use of oil is a tremendous performance. We need everything in terms of smart demand management, autonomous cars can, by the way, due to also now in a study of your previous employer, it can go both ways. You could have more cars driving, more demand for transport if grandma can be driven and your 2-year-old can be driven.
Right.
So, yeah. But it is, we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of delivering no increase in oil use in the rest of the transportation.
How do the Statoil scenarios address the issue of the 1.2 billion people in the world that the World Bank and IMF say don't have electricity?
Well, that is that's one of the key challenges that we have, is that we have to deliver on a number of sustainable development goals. And if you think about what the UN did just before the Paris Agreement was signed, it's a bit under the radar for a lot of media in the West, at least, is that we have to deliver on those by 2030. That's 13 years now. It's the 1.2 billion people without access to electricity. One of the things that that makes that possible in our, we don't count the number of people there, but the decarbonization of electricity through both distributed and utility scale renewable electricity is probably one of the things that is necessary to deliver electricity to the 400 million Indians that don't have it, the 600 million Africans that don't have it. The other part of the challenge is that we have 2.4 billion people who don't have clean cooking and heating facilities.
Right.
And that's the sort of in the CO2 equation. It looks very sustainable. It's this biomass, right? But if you look at why is 13 of the world's 20 most polluted cities not in China, but in India? One reason is coal, but the other reason is, of course, biomass.
Being used for cooking.
Used for cooking, all the waste that we're burning. And a lot of that pollution is also inside people's homes. And it doesn't provide light for the kids to do their homework. So what China did in the 1970s was they went out of biomass into electricity and electrified the population, made a fantastic improvement in quality of life, but they did that via coal. And we have to avoid that India does the same.
Right.
So the local pollution in China within their people's homes is much less now than it was in 1970, and they got electricity in addition. And that's what we have to deliver to India as well. And then we have to do that by renewable electricity and by some gas-fired electricity, probably. So, but we don't count I can't tell you that we in our scenario have electrified everybody. You've got to remember that with 1.2 billion doesn't have, that means we have what? About 6 billion people have electricity?
Right.
After 150 years of electrification? Well, over the next 33 years, we have to deliver them to the 1.2 plus the 2.4 that are not yet born. That's 3.6 billion in 33 years. We better start electrifying.
It's still a gap to fill.
Yes.
All right. Yes, you please. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Lily Imami and I'm from FTI Consulting. And I'm curious how, you mentioned the discovery in the Barents Sea. I'm curious what your investments in, for example, offshore wind are as opposed to what the investments are in your discoveries in the Barents Sea, and what your projections are for what will be produced as a result of those discoveries and your possible developments from findings there.
In the Barents Sea?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the discovery that I mentioned, we haven't started investing a lot yet, but we might make that decision. We have explored for it, so we have spent quite a bit of money so far, but then of course the main investment costs come pretty soon. In terms of share of our capex now going into renewable electricity compared to what our rest of the capex is very low, still very low. We're an oil and gas company. We're transforming into an energy company, and that's why we say that we believe that by 2030, 15 to 20% of our capex might be in new energy solutions, offshore wind, solar, decarbonizing gas. But that by implication, then we think that 80 to 85% will still be in oil and gas. But that's also why we have ambitions now to take down the carbon intensity in our production by 20%. We we have the lowest carbon intensity in our production in the oil industry. And we take it further down. We take 3 million tons down by 2030 as well. So that's part of our climate roadmap strategy. The Johan Castberg field, I'm not sure how much it will produce at peak, but which is the one I'm talking about. 100,000 barrels maybe at 100%, yeah, per day. So, and then we're finishing a huge project in the North Sea now, which will produce 600,000 at peak. It's called the Johan Sverdrup. So we'll continue to develop new oil and gas resources if we can make it competitive to be part of that, filling that gap. Also, the notion, it's important to say that there's a lot of talk about the Barents Sea being special, but some people say it's bound to be too costly. We don't need that oil, Arctic oil or Barents Sea oil and so on. But it's important to note that cost levels do not follow latitude. The Barents Sea is cheap in many ways because the wells are much shorter than many other wells. It's relatively easy weather-wise. The waves are much less there than in the Norwegian Sea. So there are many reasons why sort of cost doesn't follow latitude. Some of the most expensive things in the world are exactly on the equator or more or less there. So when it's deep offshore. So, but we are definitely going to grow much more in renewables and in new energy solutions if we get access to the projects. And that's also a challenge here. There's not a very long queue of renewable projects lining up. So we have to take them as they come, and then hopefully be profitable.
Eirik, I think that in general that when I think about the scenarios, and especially the renewal scenario, I think it's incredibly ambitious, and that an oil company is suggesting that we could move that far, that fast, seems to me to be somewhat of a surprise. But when I look at the numbers, 85% of the world's energy is currently coming from fossil energy, and even under this incredibly ambitious program outlined in your renewal scenario, it's still 50% or something
close to 50.
By the year 2050. That to me is one of the, I think, just not very well understood facts or challenges associated with this whole thing, is that the world and our economy is still relying on fossil fuels, and it's going to be a very difficult thing to move away from it. But I think we have to think about things as you're doing in order to challenge ourselves to think of ways that we might change the path that we're on.
Yeah, and if we move away to the extent here, and we actually deliver on emission reductions, and we gradually make it possible to decarbonize gas, for instance, where we then use hydrogen, take away the CO2, the C part of the methane molecule, and we put it, which is known technology, by the way, but it's just that somebody has to pay to do it. If we gradually increase our ability to do carbon capture and storage on post-combustion.
And use, perhaps.
And maybe even use. Then there's no need to move away from fossil fuels per se. Then it's more about the most efficient way of getting there. The energy density of fossil fuels is absolutely fantastic. The viability of fossil fuels in different uses is fantastic. So if we can take away the problems associated with it, then there's no reason to look at sort of getting it to zero just to getting it to zero. But we have to start in the right direction by having the right measures, and then a lot of things will happen as the markets develop here, and somebody will come up with new technologies and so on. And the sad story is that it goes too slowly. Carbon capture and storage is absolutely not moving at all. And one of the reasons is, of course, that, as an example, the European carbon price is €5 per ton. That doesn't incentivize. And the problem for CCS is that the only incentive you have for CCS is the avoidance of a carbon price. That's the income in a carbon capture and storage project.
So we have to manage, we have to improve, and we have to adapt. Okay, everybody, let's go back and figure out those solutions.
And use
Please.
your bikes going back to work. Right?